The most painful labels are never spoken by strangers. They are spoken by the people whose approval you spend your whole life trying to earn. My name is Daniel Carter, and for years my father did not introduce me as the son who worked the hardest or the son who dreamed the biggest. Instead, whenever relatives asked about me, he would sigh, shake his head, and say that I was the family embarrassment. The strange thing is that I never heard those words for the first time in anger. I heard them during what was supposed to be one of the happiest evenings of my life. My family gathered for dinner the night before my college graduation. My mother had spent the entire afternoon preparing homemade roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, fresh rolls, and the apple pie that always appeared whenever our family celebrated something important. The dining room was decorated with blue and silver balloons, and my graduation cap rested on a chair near the living room window. My older sister Sarah had already built a successful career as a financial analyst in Chicago, and everyone seemed eager to compare my future with hers before my own future had even begun. My father, William Carter, believed in practical decisions. He had spent more than 30 years working for the same manufacturing company, rarely taking vacations, and never complaining about long hours because he believed stability was the greatest gift a parent could provide. I admired his dedication, but I never shared his definition of success. During my senior year of college, I had started developing a digital platform that would help local nonprofit organizations coordinate volunteers more efficiently. I knew it would not make me wealthy overnight. I knew it would probably require years of sacrifice. But every time I volunteered at food banks, youth programs, or neighborhood cleanups, I saw good people wasting countless hours trying to organize schedules, phone calls, and paperwork that technology could simplify. I wanted to solve that problem. To me, that dream felt meaningful. To my father, it sounded irresponsible. As dinner continued, relatives asked the usual questions. Where would I work after graduation? Which company had hired me? What salary had I accepted? I smiled politely before explaining that I planned to continue building my nonprofit platform full-time while supporting myself with freelance software development projects until it became sustainable. The room became unusually quiet. My aunt slowly lowered her fork. My uncle exchanged an awkward glance with my father. Sarah looked down at her plate without saying anything. Then my father leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath. He did not raise his voice. He did not sound angry. Somehow that made what happened next hurt even more. He looked around the table before saying, "Everyone here should know that Daniel has always chosen the difficult path." We tried to encourage him to accept an excellent engineering offer from a respected company, but he refused. Instead, he wants to chase an idea that may never become anything. I love my son, but sometimes love also means admitting when someone is making a mistake. Nobody spoke. I could feel every pair of eyes resting on me. Then my father smiled in the uncomfortable way people do when they are trying to soften an embarrassing truth. Every family has one person who keeps everyone wondering what they are thinking, he continued. Daniel is ours. He is the family embarrassment. A few nervous laughs drifted across the table. They were not cruel laughs. They were uncertain laughs from people who did not know how to respond. That somehow made them even more painful. My mother quietly whispered my father's name, hoping he would stop, but he believed he was helping me face reality. Sarah finally spoke. She told me there was still time to accept a stable career before graduation. She reminded me that dreams did not pay mortgages or health insurance premiums. I knew she meant well, yet every sentence felt like another reminder that nobody in the room truly believed in what mattered most to me. I looked around the table one last time. These were the people who had celebrated every birthday, every school achievement, every little league game, and every Christmas morning of my life. Yet in the moment when I needed confidence the most, I found only concern disguised as advice. I slowly placed my napkin beside my plate and thanked my mother for dinner. My father asked where I was going. I answered calmly that I needed some fresh air. He shook his head and told me I was running away from reality again. I simply smiled because arguing would not change anyone's mind. Outside, the evening air felt cool against my face. The neighborhood was quiet, with porch lights glowing across familiar streets where I had ridden my bicycle as a child. I sat inside my old sedan for several minutes without starting the engine. I replayed every word my father had spoken, especially the label that echoed louder than everything else. Family embarrassment. For a brief moment, I wondered if they were right. Maybe I was making the biggest mistake of my life. Maybe everyone else saw something I refused to accept. Then I opened my backpack and looked at the notebook where I had written every idea, every improvement, and every story shared by nonprofit volunteers who believed technology could help them serve their communities better. Those pages reminded me why I had started this journey. My dream had never been about proving anyone wrong. It had always been about making something useful for people who spent their lives helping others. I closed the notebook, started the engine, and drove back to my small apartment. Before going to bed, I stood in front of the whiteboard hanging above my desk and wrote one sentence across the top in bold black letters. One day my work will speak louder than every label placed upon me. I did not know how many years that promise would require. I did not know how many failures waited ahead. I only knew that beginning the next morning, I would stop trying to convince people with explanations and start convincing them with results. The months after graduation settled into a routine that looked ordinary from the outside, but demanded more determination than anything I had ever experienced. Every morning before sunrise, I sat at the small desk in my apartment reviewing freelance software contracts that paid just enough to cover rent, groceries, gasoline, and internet service. I accepted projects that few experienced developers wanted because they arrived quickly and kept the bills paid. Some days I built simple business websites. Other days I repaired outdated databases or solved technical problems for companies I would never meet in person. None of that work represented my dream, but every completed assignment purchased another evening that I could devote to the platform I truly believed in. As soon as the freelance work ended, I shifted my attention to the nonprofit project that filled every notebook, every whiteboard, and nearly every thought I had. I continued visiting community organizations across the city whenever someone agreed to spare a few minutes for a conversation. I met volunteer coordinators at food banks, animal shelters, youth mentoring programs, church outreach centers, and neighborhood resource offices. Instead of trying to impress them with complicated technology, I simply asked what slowed them down every day. Almost every answer sounded remarkably similar. They struggled to organize volunteer schedules. They spent hours making phone calls after people canceled at the last minute. They tracked attendance with handwritten notes or outdated spreadsheets that created confusion during busy events. Listening carefully became more valuable than writing software because every conversation revealed another problem worth solving. During those early months, my platform remained far from perfect. Some features worked exactly as planned, while others created unexpected frustrations. I rewrote entire sections of the program after realizing that the people using it cared far more about simplicity than advanced technology. Every mistake became another lesson, and every lesson slowly moved the project closer to becoming something genuinely useful. Financially, life remained difficult. There were weeks when I carefully calculated every purchase before entering a grocery store. I delayed replacing worn shoes because the money could instead pay for software tools or cloud hosting services. My apartment stayed modest, with secondhand furniture and a folding table that still served as my primary workspace. Friends from college began sharing exciting updates about promotions, relocation packages, retirement plans, and new homes. I celebrated every achievement because they had earned their success. But afterward, I often returned to my apartment wondering whether my father had been right all along. Those moments of doubt never lasted very long because the next morning another volunteer would describe a challenge that my platform might eventually solve, reminding me why I continued. My relationship with my family remained polite but distant. My mother called every few weeks to ask whether I was eating well and getting enough sleep. She rarely mentioned my career directly, because she knew those conversations usually ended with quiet disagreement between my father and me. My father occasionally left short voice messages reminding me that several engineering companies were still hiring talented graduates. He believed he was encouraging me. I knew his intentions came from concern, yet every message sounded like another reminder that he expected my dream to fail. Sarah visited occasionally when work brought her close to my apartment. She admired the effort I invested, but gently suggested that I spend a few years building financial security before returning to the nonprofit idea later. I appreciated her kindness, although I quietly believe that some opportunities disappear forever if they are postponed long enough. Nearly a year passed before the platform reached a point where I felt comfortable asking organizations to use it during actual volunteer events. The first group willing to participate was a small neighborhood food pantry that served families every Saturday morning. Their volunteer coordinator admitted they had nothing to lose because their existing system already created constant confusion. I arrived before sunrise on the first day of the pilot program carrying a laptop, extra charging cables, printed instructions, and far more nervousness than I wanted anyone to notice. Throughout the morning, I watched volunteers check schedules, receive updates, and communicate through the platform instead of relying on endless phone calls and handwritten lists. Not everything worked perfectly. A few notifications arrived late, and one scheduling feature confused several users. Still, by the end of the event, the coordinator smiled and told me they had finished nearly 45 minutes earlier than usual because organizing volunteers required far less time. Hearing those words filled me with a sense of encouragement that no paycheck had ever provided. A few weeks later, an animal rescue organization agreed to test an updated version of the platform. They reported similar improvements and suggested several practical changes that made the software even easier to use. Every successful pilot strengthened my confidence, although the victories remained almost completely invisible to everyone outside those organizations. My father certainly did not know about them. Whenever relatives gathered for birthdays or holidays, conversations followed the same familiar pattern. Someone would ask whether I had finally accepted a stable position. Before I could answer, another relative would mention Sarah's latest promotion or praise a cousin who had recently purchased a new home. Nobody intended to be cruel, but comparisons slowly became traditions of their own. I learned to smile, congratulate everyone sincerely, and avoid defending my choices because experience had taught me that explanations rarely changed opinions. Results would have to speak for themselves one day, even if that day still seemed far away. One quiet evening, I remained in my apartment long after finishing another freelance project. The city lights shimmered through the window while the whiteboard above my desk filled with new ideas collected from volunteers over the previous months. Looking around the room, I realized that my life appeared almost unchanged since graduation. The furniture was the same. The apartment was the same. My bank account certainly looked familiar. Yet something important had changed beneath the surface. My dream was no longer just an idea living inside notebooks. Real organizations were beginning to depend on it, however modestly. Real volunteers were saving time because of work that almost nobody else believed in. I picked up a marker and added another sentence beneath the promise I had written months earlier. Small victories become extraordinary futures when they are repeated often enough. I stepped back, looked at both sentences together, and quietly reminded myself that progress is usually invisible long before it becomes impossible to ignore. Nearly 2 years had passed since the evening I quietly left my parents' dining room, carrying nothing but disappointment and determination. My life had settled into a demanding rhythm that left very little room for comfort, but just enough room for hope. During the day, I continued accepting freelance software contracts to keep my small apartment, cover basic expenses, and fund every improvement I made to the platform. At night, I worked until exhaustion refining features suggested by nonprofit volunteers who had become my greatest teachers. The pilot programs continued producing encouraging results, yet encouragement alone could not solve every problem. More organizations expressed interest in using the platform, but I had reached a difficult point where I no longer possessed the experience necessary to guide the project through its next stage. I understood technology well enough to build software, but building software and building an organization were completely different challenges. I needed advice that could only come from someone who had already traveled the road I was attempting to follow. Unfortunately, I had no idea where to find that person. Financial pressure also became more noticeable than ever before. One of my largest freelance clients unexpectedly reduced its workload after restructuring its business, cutting nearly half of my monthly income with only a week's notice. For several evenings, I sat at my desk reviewing expenses, calculating how long I could continue supporting both myself and the platform without making painful sacrifices. I considered pausing development for several months while searching for additional freelance work, but every time I thought about delaying progress, I remembered the volunteers who had begun relying on the improvements we released every few weeks. Walking away, even temporarily, felt like abandoning something much larger than myself. Around that same time, I received an email. announcing a regional nonprofit innovation conference scheduled just over an hour away. The registration fee was modest, although even that amount required careful budgeting. At first I hesitated because spending an entire day away from freelance work meant sacrificing income one genuinely needed. Eventually, I realized that remaining isolated inside my apartment would never introduce me to the people capable of helping the project grow. I registered the following morning and hoped the decision would prove worthwhile. The conference took place inside a community college conference center filled with nonprofit leaders, volunteers, educators, technology professionals, and local government representatives. Walking through the entrance felt intimidating because nearly everyone seemed to know someone else. Groups gathered around tables exchanging stories, discussing partnerships, and greeting old colleagues. I carried only a backpack containing my laptop, business cards I had printed at home, and a notebook filled with ideas collected over the previous 2 years. During the first few presentations, I listened carefully, taking notes about volunteer engagement, sustainable funding, and community partnerships. Several speakers described challenges that sounded remarkably familiar because they matched conversations I had already experienced while visiting local organizations. During a short break, I wandered through the exhibition area where different organizations displayed community projects. While studying one presentation about volunteer coordination, I noticed an older gentleman quietly reading the demonstration materials with genuine interest instead of rushing toward the next display. His conference badge identified him as Benjamin Foster. The name sounded familiar, although I could not immediately remember why. We started talking after he asked whether I worked for one of the exhibitors. I explained that I had built a volunteer coordination platform independently and was testing it with several nonprofit organizations while supporting myself through freelance software development. Instead of politely ending the conversation the way many people had before, he asked thoughtful questions. He wanted to know what problems inspired the project, how volunteers reacted to different features, which organizations had participated in the pilot programs, and what lessons I had learned from every mistake. Nearly 30 minutes passed before either of us realized the next presentation had already begun. Finally, he smiled and introduced himself more completely. Benjamin had spent more than 3 decades advising nonprofit organizations throughout the state, helping them improve operations, strengthen leadership, and expand community impact. Suddenly, I remembered reading one of his articles while researching volunteer management nearly a year earlier. Feeling slightly embarrassed, I apologized for taking so much of his time. He laughed warmly and replied that meaningful conversations were the reason he attended conferences in the first place. Before leaving, he asked whether I would be willing to show him the platform over coffee the following week. I accepted immediately, although I secretly worried that he might discover flaws I had overlooked for years. Several days later, we met at a quiet neighborhood coffee shop. I opened my laptop and carefully demonstrated every feature, every workflow, and every improvement developed through the pilot programs. Benjamin watched patiently without interrupting. Occasionally, he wrote notes inside a small leather notebook. When I finished, he remained silent for several seconds. My stomach tightened because I expected polite criticism followed by encouragement to keep trying. Instead, he looked directly at me and said something I had not heard from anyone outside the nonprofit organizations using the platform. Daniel, this is solving a real problem. Those 7 words carried more weight than I could describe because they came from someone who understood the field far better than I did. He did not tell me the platform was perfect. In fact, he spent the next hour identifying weaknesses that required immediate attention. He explained that the technology was promising, but the experience needed to become simpler for busy volunteer coordinators. He pointed out opportunities to improve communication between organizations, simplify reporting, and make onboarding easier for people with limited technical experience. Every suggestion was practical. Every criticism was respectful. Most importantly, every recommendation came from someone who genuinely believed the project deserved to succeed. Before we left the coffee shop, Benjamin closed his notebook and smiled. If you are willing to work very hard, he said, I am willing to help you avoid mistakes that took me decades to understand. For a moment, I struggled to answer because I realized this meeting represented something I had quietly hoped for ever since graduation. My family still believed I was chasing an impossible dream. Most people saw only a young developer working alone in a small apartment. Yet sitting across the table was someone with decades of experience who had looked beyond my circumstances and recognized genuine potential. As I drove home that afternoon, the road ahead looked exactly the same as it had that morning, but everything inside me had changed. For the first time since beginning this journey, I was no longer carrying the dream completely alone. Benjamin Foster never tried to impress me with motivational speeches or dramatic promises. Instead, he gave me something much more valuable. He gave me honest guidance that forced me to see my work through the eyes of the people I wanted to serve. We met every Tuesday morning at the same neighborhood coffee shop before either of us began the rest of the day. I always arrived carrying my laptop and a notebook filled with new ideas, while Benjamin brought the same weathered leather notebook that seemed to contain decades of experience on every page. During our first few meetings, I expected him to teach me how to attract investors or secure large grants. Instead, he asked questions that completely changed the way I approached the project. He wanted to know how many volunteer coordinators could complete basic tasks without reading instructions. He asked whether senior volunteers who rarely used computers felt comfortable navigating the platform. He wondered how much time a nonprofit actually saved after switching from handwritten schedules to the digital system. At first, I focused on explaining technical features because that was the language I understood best. Benjamin smiled patiently before reminding me that people rarely fall in love with software. They fall in love with solutions that make their lives easier. Those words stayed with me every time I opened my computer. Rather than adding impressive new functions, I began simplifying everything that already existed. Buttons became larger and easier to recognize. Menus required fewer steps. Volunteer coordinators could update schedules with only a few clicks instead of navigating multiple screens. Every improvement came directly from conversations with the people using the platform rather than assumptions I made while sitting alone in my apartment. Benjamin also encouraged me to spend less time talking about the technology itself and more time visiting the organizations depending on it. I followed his advice without hesitation. Over the next several months, I traveled across the city meeting directors, volunteers, and community leaders wherever they gathered. Some meetings took place inside church fellowship halls. Others happened in school cafeterias after afternoon tutoring programs ended. I visited food pantries, neighborhood outreach centers, senior assistance organizations, and youth mentoring programs. Instead of delivering polished presentations, I listened carefully while volunteers described their daily routines. They pointed out small frustrations that outsiders rarely noticed, but that consumed valuable hours every week. Every conversation produced another practical improvement, and with each update, the platform became less like my personal project and more like a tool shaped by an entire community. The changes produced results faster than I expected. Organizations that had participated in the earliest pilot programs began recommending the platform to other nonprofit leaders. Soon I received emails from groups I had never contacted asking whether they could schedule demonstrations. Word spread quietly through conversations between volunteers who simply wanted to help one another work more efficiently. The project still generated almost no income, but it generated something equally important. It earned trust. That trust encouraged more organizations to participate, and every new partnership created additional opportunities to refine the platform even further. One Saturday morning, I visited the neighborhood food pantry that had been among the first organizations willing to test my software. The volunteer coordinator greeted me with a smile before proudly explaining that they had welcomed nearly 30% more volunteers over the previous 6 months without increasing administrative work. She showed me how quickly new volunteers could register, receive assignments, and communicate schedule changes. Watching the system operate smoothly without my assistance felt surprisingly emotional because it confirmed that the platform had grown beyond the fragile prototype that once existed only inside my apartment. It had become part of real communities helping real people every single week. Benjamin continued celebrating every milestone while refusing to let me become comfortable. Whenever I proudly demonstrated a successful feature, he responded by asking how it could become even easier for someone using an older laptop or a slower internet connection. Whenever an organization praised the platform, he reminded me to ask what still frustrated them. His standards remained high because he believed lasting success belonged to people willing to improve even after receiving compliments. Looking back, I realized he was teaching me far more than software development. He was teaching me humility, patience, and the discipline to keep learning long after others believed the work was finished. During one of our weekly meetings, Benjamin suggested that I begin documenting measurable results from every organization using the platform. We created simple reports comparing volunteer participation, scheduling efficiency, communication response times, and administrative hours before and after implementation. The numbers surprised even me. Several organizations reported saving dozens of staff hours each month. Others experienced noticeable increases in volunteer retention because communication became more reliable and organized. Those reports transformed encouraging stories into credible evidence that community leaders could confidently share with one another. Around that same time, an unexpected email arrived from Grace Mitchell, a local reporter covering community development and nonprofit innovation for the city's newspaper. She explained that several nonprofit directors had independently mentioned the same volunteer coordination platform during interviews about successful community partnerships. Curious about the growing interest, she asked whether I would be willing to meet and discuss the project. I almost declined because I had never considered myself someone worthy of a newspaper story. Benjamin encouraged me to accept immediately. He reminded me that the article was not really about me. It was about the volunteers and organizations whose work had become easier because people chose to collaborate instead of working in isolation. A few days later, Grace visited one of the nonprofit organizations using the platform before meeting me for coffee nearby. Rather than asking dramatic questions about personal success, she focused on the impact the project created inside local neighborhoods. She interviewed volunteer coordinators, watched families receive services, and spoke with community leaders who described how better organization allowed them to devote more energy to helping people instead of managing paperwork. When she finally asked why I had spent years building the platform despite financial uncertainty and limited recognition, I paused before answering honestly. I told her that meaningful work rarely begins with applause. It begins when someone notices a problem that everyone else has accepted and quietly decides to solve it anyway. She smiled, wrote down every word, and thanked me for my time. A week later, the article appeared in the Sunday edition of the local newspaper under a headline celebrating innovative solutions strengthening neighborhood nonprofits. Reading the story felt surreal because it focused far less on my personal journey than on the communities benefiting from the project. The article spread quickly among nonprofit networks, bringing new messages from organizations interested in learning more. My phone rang more often than ever before, and my email inbox steadily filled with invitations to demonstrate the platform. Yet despite the growing attention throughout the community, life inside my parents' home remained completely unchanged. My father still believed I was struggling through another uncertain chapter that would eventually end with me accepting a conventional job. He had no idea that while he continued worrying about my future, the first quiet signs of that future were already beginning to appear. The newspaper article created momentum that I had never experienced before, but Benjamin reminded me that attention alone was never the destination. He often said that recognition opens doors, but preparation determines whether those doors remain open. I carried those words with me during every meeting that followed. Within a month of the article's publication, several nonprofit directors introduced me to leaders from neighboring organizations, and each conversation revealed new opportunities as well as greater expectations. My calendar, once filled mostly with freelance deadlines, gradually became occupied by demonstrations, planning sessions, and community meetings. Although I still depended on freelance software work to pay my rent, I found myself waking earlier and staying awake later because every new organization using the platform represented another chance to prove that the project deserved to exist. Benjamin encouraged me to stop thinking like an independent developer and begin thinking like someone responsible for a growing community resource. Together, we refined presentation materials that focused less on technology and more on measurable outcomes. Instead of describing software features, I showed how volunteer coordinators recovered valuable hours every week, how communication became more reliable during large community events, and how organizations could dedicate more energy to serving families instead of managing paperwork. Those practical examples resonated far more than technical explanations ever had. During one meeting at a regional nonprofit coalition, several executive directors, exchanged stories about the improvements they had experienced after adopting the platform. Listening quietly from the back of the room, I realized they were convincing one another without any help from me. Their trust had become the strongest recommendation the project could receive. A few weeks later, Benjamin called and asked whether I could meet him downtown after lunch. When I arrived, he handed me a sealed envelope with a smile that immediately caught my attention. Inside was an invitation from the city's Department of Community Partnerships requesting that I present the platform before a review committee exploring new ways to strengthen cooperation among local nonprofit organizations. I read the letter twice before speaking because I wanted to make sure I had not misunderstood its meaning. Benjamin laughed softly and told me that opportunities like this rarely appeared by accident. Years of consistent work had quietly placed my name in conversations taking place far beyond my awareness. Excitement quickly gave way to nervousness. Presenting before experienced city officials felt very different from speaking with nonprofit volunteers who already understood the daily challenges I was trying to solve. For the next several weeks, Benjamin transformed our Tuesday meetings into intensive preparation sessions. He challenged every assumption I made, questioned every statistic I presented, and reminded me repeatedly that honesty would always be more persuasive than exaggerated promises. Whenever I attempted to predict dramatic future results, he interrupted me and asked what evidence supported those claims. If I could not answer with confidence, the statement disappeared from the presentation. By the time we finished rehearsing, the presentation had become remarkably simple. It focused on verified results, real community partnerships, and practical solutions already working inside local organizations. The morning of the presentation arrived with clear skies and cool autumn air. Standing outside City Hall, I looked at the historic building and remembered the night I had left my parents' dinner table believing that almost nobody understood why I had chosen this path. Now I was walking through the front entrance carrying years of effort inside a single laptop bag. The committee included nonprofit administrators, city staff members, and community development specialists. They asked thoughtful questions about long-term sustainability, accessibility, volunteer engagement, and data security. Because Benjamin had challenged me with similar questions for months, I answered calmly and honestly. Whenever I did not know something, I admitted it and explained how I planned to address the issue. By the end of the meeting, several committee members thanked me for focusing on practical community needs instead of promoting technology for its own sake. 2 weeks later, I received another letter. This time it informed me that the city had approved a formal partnership allowing additional nonprofit organizations across the community to implement the platform through a coordinated pilot initiative. I sat quietly in my apartment reading the letter several times before calling Benjamin. He answered the phone with his usual calm voice, but I could hear genuine pride when I shared the news. He congratulated me briefly before reminding me that this milestone represented the beginning of greater responsibility rather than the end of the journey. As implementation expanded, the platform reached organizations I had never imagined serving only a few years earlier. Community centers, youth mentorship programs, neighborhood outreach initiatives, and volunteer networks began adopting the system with support from the city's partnership. Every successful implementation strengthened the growing belief that small, consistent improvements could create meaningful change when enough people worked toward the same purpose. Shortly afterward, another unexpected message arrived, this time from the organizing committee for the annual Community Leadership Awards. The letter informed me that I had been nominated in recognition of the platform's measurable impact on nonprofit collaboration throughout the city. I stared at the nomination notice in complete disbelief. I had never built the project with awards in mind. My original goal had simply been to help volunteers, spend more time serving people and less time managing schedules. Yet somehow those quiet years of work had led to recognition I had never expected. The nomination package also explained that recipients would be honored during a formal public ceremony attended by nonprofit leaders, city officials, community partners, local media representatives, and invited family members. At the bottom of the letter were several guest invitations reserved for immediate relatives. I held those invitations for a long time without deciding what to do. My father still believed I had chosen an impractical life. My mother continued worrying about my financial future. Sarah remained convinced that I would eventually leave the nonprofit world for a traditional career. None of them knew about the city partnership or the growing number of organizations using the platform. They had never asked, and I had stopped trying to convince them years earlier. Eventually, I placed 3 invitations into separate envelopes addressed to my parents and my sister. I included only a brief handwritten note thanking them for coming if they were able. I did not mention the nomination itself or explain why the ceremony mattered. I simply hoped they would attend. After sealing the envelopes, I walked to the neighborhood mailbox just before sunset. As they disappeared through the slot, I realized that for the first time since graduation, I was no longer inviting my family to believe in my dream. I was inviting them to witness what quiet perseverance had already become. The evening of the Community Leadership Awards arrived with the quiet confidence that often accompanies moments capable of changing an ordinary life forever. I arrived at the downtown Civic Center nearly an hour before the ceremony began because I wanted enough time to greet the nonprofit leaders and volunteers who had helped transform a simple idea into something that now belonged to an entire community. The large ballroom slowly filled with conversations, warm handshakes, and familiar faces from organizations I had visited over the past several years. Volunteer coordinators introduced me to board members. Executive directors thanked me for listening to their concerns long before anyone else believed the project could make a difference. Several city officials stopped to congratulate me on the expanding partnership, reminding me that the pilot program had already encouraged additional organizations to join the initiative. Standing among so many people who believed in the same mission felt surreal because I could still remember the nights when I had worked completely alone inside my small apartment, wondering whether any of this would ever matter. Benjamin Foster arrived carrying the same weathered leather notebook that had accompanied him to every meeting since the day we first met. He smiled, shook my hand, and quietly reminded me to enjoy the evening instead of worrying about outcomes beyond my control. He had repeated that advice countless times over the years, and somehow it always managed to calm my thoughts. As guests continued entering the ballroom, I found myself looking toward the entrance every few minutes without realizing it. Part of me wondered whether my family would come. I had mailed the invitations without expectations because I knew they still understood very little about the path I had chosen. They had never seen the organizations using the platform. They had never attended community meetings where volunteers described how much easier their work had become. They only knew the uncertain beginning, not the years of steady progress that followed. About 15 minutes before the program started, I finally saw them. My mother entered first, looking around the room with quiet curiosity. Sarah followed beside her, reading the printed program she had received at the registration table. My father walked several steps behind them, wearing the same reserved expression he often carried into unfamiliar situations. When our eyes met across the ballroom, he offered a small nod that seemed both polite and uncertain. I walked over to welcome them, thanked them sincerely for coming, and introduced them to Benjamin. My father shook his hand respectfully without realizing how profoundly this man had influenced my journey. Benjamin simply smiled and said that he had learned as much from me as I had learned from him, a generous statement that immediately made me uncomfortable because I knew it was not entirely true. Before I could respond, one of the event coordinators asked me to prepare backstage for the ceremony. I excused myself, leaving my family seated near the middle of the ballroom while volunteers, nonprofit directors, educators, business leaders, and local officials gradually filled every table. The program began with a celebration of community partnerships across the city. Several awards recognized organizations serving children, veterans, senior citizens, and families facing difficult circumstances. Each recipient reminded the audience that meaningful change never happened because of one individual. It happened because ordinary people chose to work together with patience and consistency. Listening backstage, I realized those words perfectly described everything Benjamin had tried to teach me. Finally, the presenter approached the category recognizing innovation in community leadership. A short video appeared on large screens throughout the ballroom. It showed volunteers organizing neighborhood events, families receiving assistance from local nonprofits, and community leaders explaining how improved coordination had allowed them to serve more people with greater efficiency. Then my name appeared on the screen. The narrator described the volunteer platform, the partnerships formed throughout the city, and the measurable improvements reported by participating organizations. More importantly, the video focused on the volunteers themselves, highlighting their dedication rather than the technology supporting their efforts. When the presenter announced that I had been selected to receive the Community Leadership Award, the entire ballroom rose in a standing ovation that seemed to continue far longer than I expected. Walking toward the stage, I briefly glanced across the audience and saw my family standing with everyone else. My mother's eyes filled with tears she made no attempt to hide. Sarah looked from the stage to the program in her hands, as though trying to reconcile the brother she thought she understood with the person now being recognized before. The entire city. My father remained standing completely still. The expression on his face was unlike anything I had ever seen before. It was not simply pride. It was the quiet realization that years of certainty had suddenly given way to unexpected truth. Accepting the award, I thanked the volunteers, nonprofit leaders, city partners, and every organization willing to trust an unfinished idea during its earliest days. Then I spoke about perseverance in the simplest way I knew how. I explained that meaningful work often grows quietly, far away from applause, and that some of the most worthwhile journeys begin long before anyone else understands where they might lead. I thanked Benjamin publicly for teaching me that listening always mattered more than impressing people. I expressed gratitude to every volunteer who had shared honest feedback instead of easy compliments, because those conversations had shaped the project far more than I ever could alone. I never mentioned the painful dinner years earlier. I never repeated the words that had once followed me like a shadow. There was no reason to reopen old wounds on an evening dedicated to gratitude. As I finished speaking, another standing ovation filled the ballroom. Looking toward my family's table one more time, I saw my father slowly lowering his eyes before wiping away tears he had clearly hoped no one would notice. In that quiet moment, before either of us had spoken a single word, I understood something that no award could ever measure. The city had recognized my work, but my father had finally begun to see the sun standing before him instead of the fear he had carried for so many years. When the ceremony ended, the ballroom remained filled with conversations, congratulations, and photographs, but my attention kept drifting toward the table where my family was still standing together. For several minutes, they spoke quietly among themselves while guests approached to shake my hand and introduce themselves. Volunteer coordinators thanked me for listening when few others had taken their challenges seriously. City officials discussed plans for expanding the partnership into neighboring communities. Reporters requested brief interviews about the future of the platform. I appreciated every conversation, yet throughout the evening I sensed that the most important discussion had not happened yet. Eventually the crowd began to thin as people collected their coats and prepared to leave. Benjamin walked beside me and quietly placed a hand on my shoulder. He smiled in the calm way that had become familiar over the years, and simply said that some victories cannot be measured by awards. Then he excused himself, giving me a respectful nod before walking toward the exit. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was leaving space for something that only my family and I could resolve. My mother reached me first. She wrapped her arms around me without saying a word. When she finally stepped back, tears filled her eyes as she whispered that she had never imagined how many lives the project had touched. Sarah followed with a warm embrace of her own before admitting that she had been completely wrong about what success could look like. She confessed that she had judged my future by comparing it with familiar career paths, because those were the only paths she understood. Hearing her honesty brought me more peace than I expected because there was no defensiveness in her voice. There was only sincerity. My father remained several feet away, his hands resting inside the pockets of his suit jacket as though he still struggled to find the right words. For most of my life, William Carter had always seemed certain of his opinions. That confidence had shaped our family in countless positive ways. But on this evening, I saw something entirely different. I saw a father trying to understand how years of love and years of misunderstanding could exist at the same time. Finally, he asked whether we could talk outside before everyone left. I agreed without hesitation. We stepped into the cool evening air beyond the civic center where the city lights reflected softly across the sidewalks. Cars passed quietly in the distance while guests continued leaving the building behind us. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then my father looked toward the ground before breaking the silence. He admitted that he had spent years believing his greatest responsibility as a parent was protecting me from disappointment. In his mind, Encouraging a stable career had been an act of love because he feared watching me struggle through uncertainty. He confessed that every time I rejected another traditional opportunity, he became more convinced that I was making a mistake he could somehow prevent. Then his voice became quieter than I had ever heard before. He said that somewhere along the way he had stopped listening to my reasons because he had become too focused on my risks. He apologized for measuring my future only by financial security while ignoring the purpose that gave my work meaning. After another pause, he admitted that the words he had spoken at our family dinner years earlier had never truly left his memory. He remembered the exact expression on my face after he called me the family embarrassment, and he told me that watching the entire ballroom stand and applaud that evening forced him to realize how completely he had misunderstood not only my work, but also my character. I listened without interrupting because this conversation was no longer about defending myself. It was about understanding one another honestly for the first time in years. When he finished speaking, I thanked him for telling me the truth. I explained that his words had hurt more deeply than he probably realized, not because strangers had believed them, but because they came from the person whose respect mattered most to me. I also admitted something that surprised even myself. During those difficult years, I had often wondered whether he might actually be right. There were countless nights when financial pressure, uncertainty, and exhaustion tempted me to abandon everything I had built. Yet every time I visited another nonprofit organization or watched volunteers save valuable time serving their communities, I remembered why I had started. My dream had never been about proving my family wrong. It had always been about solving a problem that deserved attention. My father nodded slowly before telling me that hearing those words made him realize how often parents mistake control for guidance. He explained that he had believed experience automatically gave him better judgment, but he now understood that experience should also include the humility to recognize when a son sees possibilities his father cannot yet imagine. We stood together quietly for several moments before he reached into his pocket and removed a folded piece of paper. It was the handwritten note I had enclosed with the invitation to the ceremony. He said he had carried it with him all evening because he kept wondering why I had still invited him after everything that had happened between us. I smiled gently and answered with complete honesty. I told him that despite every disagreement, he had always been my father, and deep inside I had never stopped hoping that one day he would understand why I chose this path. The ceremony had not changed who I was. It had simply allowed him to see the years of work that had remained invisible. His eyes filled again as he quietly thanked me for giving him that opportunity instead of closing the door forever. Before we walked back inside to meet my mother and Sarah, he placed his hand on my shoulder exactly as he had done throughout my childhood whenever he wanted me to know he believed in me. This time the gesture carried a different meaning. It was no longer encouragement toward the future he had imagined for me. It was acceptance of the future I had built with patience, perseverance, and faith even when almost no one else could see where the journey was leading. The weeks following the ceremony brought changes that no award alone could have created. The platform continued expanding through the city partnership, but the greatest transformation happened in places that never appeared in newspaper articles or community reports. It happened during ordinary moments that quietly rebuilt relationships once damaged by misunderstanding. My father began calling every Sunday afternoon, not to ask whether I had finally accepted a traditional job, but to ask which organizations had joined the platform that week and what challenges we were solving together. At first, the conversations felt unfamiliar because we had spent so many years speaking around my work, instead of about it. Gradually, those phone calls became something I looked forward to. He listened with genuine curiosity as I explained how neighborhood food pantries coordinated volunteers more efficiently during holiday food drives, or how youth mentoring programs reduced scheduling conflicts that had once frustrated families and volunteers alike. Sometimes he admitted he did not fully understand the technology, but he always wanted to understand the people whose lives it helped. That difference meant more to me than I could easily describe. My mother noticed the change immediately. During family dinners, she no longer worried that every conversation about my career might become another disagreement. Instead, she watched my father ask thoughtful questions while Sarah offered ideas from her own experience managing complex financial projects. For the first time in many years, our discussions focused on possibilities rather than doubts. One Saturday morning, my father surprised me by asking whether he could visit the office our growing team had recently rented downtown. It was not an impressive office by corporate standards. The space contained a modest conference room, several workstations, a small kitchen, and whiteboards filled with notes describing upcoming improvements requested by nonprofit partners. To me, however, it represented years of quiet perseverance finally taking physical form. When my parents arrived, I introduced them to every member of our small team. Most were young professionals who had left comfortable careers because they believed technology could strengthen communities when designed with compassion instead of convenience alone. Watching them explain their work to my parents filled me with unexpected pride because I realized the project had grown into something far greater than one person's dream. During the visit, one of our nonprofit partners stopped by unexpectedly to deliver homemade cookies as a thank you for helping organize hundreds of volunteers during a recent community event. The executive director described how the platform had allowed their organization to respond more quickly after severe storms damaged several neighborhoods. Earlier that spring, instead of spending valuable hours calling volunteers individually, they coordinated relief efforts almost immediately, connecting families with assistance while the community needed it most. My father listened carefully throughout the conversation. After our guest left, he stood quietly beside one of the whiteboards before turning toward me with an expression I recognized from childhood whenever he felt deeply moved but struggled to express it. He admitted that until that moment he had imagined my work mostly as computer programming. Seeing real people walk through the office to describe lives improved by the project helped him understand that the software had always been only a tool. The true purpose had always been serving communities. A few months later, our city announced plans to expand the partnership into neighboring counties after reviewing the measurable success achieved during the pilot initiative. Community leaders from surrounding areas requested demonstrations, and nonprofit organizations began contacting us faster than our small team could schedule meetings. Growth required careful planning, but Benjamin reminded me never to confuse expansion with purpose. Every decision still had to answer the same simple question he had asked during our earliest conversations. Would this make life easier for the people serving others every day? That principle remained at the center of every improvement we made. Around the same time, my grandmother celebrated her 80th birthday, bringing relatives together for the first large family gathering since the award ceremony. As everyone settled around long tables inside a local community hall, familiar conversations filled the room. Cousins shared stories about their children, aunts exchanged recipes, and uncles discussed work, travel, and retirement plans. Several relatives who had seen newspaper coverage or community reports approached me with congratulations, asking thoughtful questions about the platform and the nonprofit partnerships. Years earlier, those same gatherings often included awkward conversations about when I might finally pursue a more stable career. This time, the atmosphere felt entirely different. During dinner, my father slowly stood to tap his glass, asking everyone for a moment of attention before the birthday cake was served. The room gradually became quiet. Looking around at our family, he spoke with a calm sincerity that immediately captured everyone's attention. He said there was something important he wanted to share, not because anyone had asked him to, but because he believed honesty should never arrive too late. He admitted that several years earlier he had openly questioned my decisions and judged my future according to standards that now seemed far too narrow. He confessed that he had mistaken unfamiliarity for failure and certainty for wisdom. Then, with our entire family listening, he smiled toward me and said that he had never been more grateful to discover how wrong he had been. He explained that true success could not always be measured by predictable careers or comfortable salaries. Sometimes it appeared in neighborhoods strengthened by ordinary people willing to serve one another with dedication and compassion. The room remained silent for several moments before warm applause gradually filled the hall. I did not feel victorious because my father had admitted his mistake. Instead, I felt grateful because he had chosen humility over pride, demonstrating a kind of courage that deserves just as much respect as perseverance. Later that evening, after most guests had returned home, my father and I carried folding chairs back into storage together. He smiled and joked that years of factory work had prepared him well for moving heavy furniture, while years of nonprofit meetings had apparently prepared me for stacking chairs efficiently. We both laughed, and the simplicity of that moment stayed with me long afterward. It reminded me that healing rarely happens through one dramatic conversation alone. It grows through countless ordinary moments when people choose understanding instead of assumptions. As we locked the community hall and walked toward the parking lot beneath a sky filled with quiet stars, I realized that the greatest reward from this journey had never been recognition, newspaper articles, or public applause. It was watching my family slowly replace judgment with respect, fear with trust, and distance with genuine connection. 1 year passed more quickly than I ever imagined. Looking back, it no longer felt as though my life had been divided into victories and disappointments. Instead, it felt divided into moments when I believed that other people's opinions determined my future, and the day I finally understood that purpose has a quieter voice than approval. The platform continued growing beyond the city where everything had begun. Neighboring counties joined the partnership one after another, each adapting the system to meet the unique needs of their own nonprofit organizations. Community leaders shared ideas with one another instead of working in isolation. Volunteers found opportunities more easily, and organizations that once struggled to coordinate large events discovered they could serve far more families without exhausting their staff. Our small office expanded into a larger space filled with new team members who brought fresh ideas and different experiences while remaining committed to the same simple mission that had inspired the project from the beginning. Benjamin still visited every Tuesday morning, although our meetings gradually became conversations between colleagues rather than lessons from mentor to student. Even then, he never allowed me to become distracted by recognition or rapid growth. Whenever someone praised the success of the platform, he smiled and reminded me that software should never become the story. The people using it to strengthen their communities would always matter more. Those words continued guiding every important decision we made. During the spring, I received an invitation to speak at the State Community Partnership Conference, where nonprofit leaders, educators, volunteers, business owners, and local officials gathered to exchange ideas about strengthening neighborhoods through collaboration. Standing backstage before my presentation, I remembered another stage only a year earlier where my family had witnessed the true impact of my work for the first time. This event felt different because I no longer carried the quiet burden of proving myself. I simply wanted to share practical lessons that might help other communities build stronger partnerships of their own. The audience responded warmly, asking thoughtful questions about listening to volunteers, measuring meaningful results, and remaining patient when progress seemed slow. As the session ended, several young professionals approached to tell me they had postponed meaningful ideas because they feared disappointing people they loved. I encouraged each of them to respect their families while remembering that no one else could discover the purpose they had been given. Every worthwhile journey eventually requires someone to take the first uncertain step. A few months later, Thanksgiving brought our family together once again, this time at my parents' home. Walking through the front door felt strangely familiar, yet completely different from the tense evening years earlier that had quietly changed the direction of my life. The dining room looked almost the same. My mother had prepared many of the same favorite dishes. The laughter of relatives filled every room, and children chased one another through the hallway while adults shared stories around the kitchen island. The difference was not the house. The difference was the atmosphere. There was no awkward silence whenever someone asked about my work. Instead, my father proudly introduced me to distant relatives by explaining how nonprofit organizations across several communities were working together more effectively because ordinary people had believed that small improvements could create lasting change. Hearing those words from him still felt almost unbelievable. After dinner, while everyone enjoyed dessert and conversation, my father asked whether I would join him on the back porch for a few minutes. The late autumn air felt cool, and colorful leaves drifted quietly across the yard where I had played as a child. He reached into the pocket of his jacket and carefully removed a familiar notebook with worn edges. My heart immediately recognized it. It was the notebook I had carried during the earliest days of the project, filled with sketches, ideas, volunteer interviews, and handwritten reminders that had traveled with me almost everywhere. I had believed it was lost years earlier while moving between apartments. Smiling gently, my father explained that he had found it inside a storage box after helping my mother organize the garage several months before the award ceremony. At first, he considered returning it immediately, but after reading only the first few pages, he decided to keep it until the right moment. He admitted that seeing the countless notes, revisions, questions, and observations recorded long before anyone recognized the project helped him understand how much quiet work had existed beneath what he once dismissed as an unrealistic dream. He handed the notebook back to me and said there was something he wanted me to remember for the rest of my life. He told me that every parent hopes to prepare a child for the future, but sometimes the child ends up teaching the parent instead. He said I had reminded him that courage is not refusing to feel uncertainty. Courage is continuing to move forward even when the people whose opinions matter most cannot yet see what you see. Then he looked directly at me with the same steady eyes that had watched me grow from childhood into adulthood and spoke words I never expected to hear. He said, "Daniel, years ago I believed you embarrassed this family because I thought you were walking away from security. Today I understand that you were actually walking toward purpose. I have never been prouder to call you my son." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. There was nothing left that required explanation because forgiveness had quietly replaced old disappointment long before either of us realized it. We returned inside together where my mother and Sarah welcomed us with warm smiles, and the evening continued with laughter, shared memories, and the comfortable feeling of a family no longer divided by fear. Looking around the table, I realized that success had never been defined by awards, newspaper articles, expanding partnerships, or public recognition. Those achievements opened wonderful opportunities, but they were never the greatest reward. The greatest reward was discovering that patience could outlast misunderstanding, that kindness could survive disappointment, and that quiet perseverance could eventually speak more clearly than any label ever placed upon a person. If my journey taught me anything, it is that the people who doubt you today are not always your enemies. Sometimes they are simply afraid because they love you and cannot yet imagine the future you are brave enough to pursue. Continue building with integrity, continue serving with humility, and allow your work to become the voice that speaks long after every painful opinion has faded away.